ballroom of the Ashford Region Hotel had been dressed for the evening in white orchids and soft gold light, and the waitstaff moved between the tables with the rehearsed grace of people who understood that charity dinners were performances first and kindnesses second. Nearly 300 guests had gathered that Friday in late October to raise money for a children's literacy fund that most of them could not have described in detail. And the champagne had already begun to loosen the careful architecture of polite conversation. Near the back of the room, at a high table crowded with men in rented tuxedos, a project foreman named Kirk Dunlap was explaining to anyone who would listen that the evening was about to get interesting, because he had arranged a surprise for a man he had spent the better part of 2 years quietly despising. The man, of course, was Raymond Sutton, and the woman Kirk had chosen as the instrument of his joke was already seated at a corner table near the window. Alone, her dark hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, her fingers resting on the stem of a water glass she had not yet touched. She wore a deep green dress that did not call attention to itself, and she sat with the particular stillness of someone who had once been comfortable in rooms like this and had since learned to survive them differently. Raymond Sutton was 41 years old. He was a plumber by trade, the kind of plumber other plumbers called when the job had already gone wrong twice. And he had hands that knew the inside of a wall the way a surgeon knows the inside of a chest. He had grown up on the south side of Bridgeport, Connecticut, the youngest of 3 sons born to a pipefitter and a school cafeteria cook. And he had never once in his life pretended to be anything other than what he was. He had married at 24. His wife, a dental hygienist with a laugh that could fill a kitchen, had died of pancreatic cancer 14 months after their daughter was born. And the speed of the loss had left him standing in the doorway of an empty bedroom holding a child who did not yet know the word for what had happened. The child's name was Hazel. She was 7 now. She stood beside him as they entered the ballroom that evening, her small hand wrapped around 3 of his fingers, her other arm holding a canvas tote bag she had decorated herself with fabric markers. Inside the bag was a sketchbook, a set of colored pencils, and a folded paper star she had made that afternoon from the back of a grocery receipt. She wore a lavender dress her grandmother had sewn from a pattern found in a library book, and her shoes were clean but not new, and her hair had been braided with the careful, slightly uneven precision of a father who had learned the craft from a 9-minute video he had watched 40 times. Kirk Dunlap saw them from across the room. He set down his bourbon and smiled, the way a man smiles when the thing he has been waiting for has finally walked through the door. Raymond had not wanted to come. He had told himself that charity galas were for people who had enough money to feel guilty about it, and that a plumber with a 2nd-grade daughter and a 30-year mortgage did not belong at a table where the napkins were folded into swans. But a week earlier, a colleague named Pete Navarro had pulled him aside at a job site and told him with what seemed like genuine warmth that a woman at the gala had asked to meet him. Pete had described her as kind, quiet, recently widowed, someone who understood what it meant to sit at a table alone. He had told Raymond that the evening would be good for him, that Hazel would enjoy the dessert table, and that sometimes a man owed it to himself to put on a clean shirt and walk into a room where no one expected him. Raymond had believed him because Pete had never lied to him before, and because the loneliness of the past 6 years had settled into his bones the way cold settles into old pipes, slowly and then all at once. What Raymond did not know was that Pete Navarro owed Kirk Dunlap $4,000 from a poker game the previous spring, and that the invitation had not been an act of friendship. It had been a transaction. Kirk Dunlap was 38, broad-shouldered and loud in the way certain men are loud when they have confused volume with authority. He managed a commercial contracting crew that occasionally subcontracted Raymond's plumbing work, and he had resented Raymond from the first week they had shared a job site. The resentment was not complicated. Raymond was quiet, competent, and liked by the clients in a way that Kirk, for all his handshaking and backslapping, had never managed to be. Homeowners asked for Raymond by name. Inspectors waved his work through without a second look, and once at a company barbecue, Kirk had overheard a senior partner say that Raymond Sutton was the most reliable man on their roster, and the sentence had lodged in Kirk's chest like a splinter he could not reach. So Kirk had devised a small entertainment. He had arranged for Raymond to arrive at the gala believing he was meeting a romantic prospect, and he had chosen, as the other half of the joke, the woman now seated alone at the corner table. A woman the men at Kirk's table had already spent the better part of an hour discussing in voices they did not bother to lower. They called her the ghost, because she appeared at events without introduction and left without saying goodbye, and because the slight unevenness of her walk, the result of an injury no one in the room knew the origin of, had given them permission to decide she was someone to be pitied rather than known. Her name was Marin Aldridge. She was 33 years old, and the story she carried was one she had not told anyone in that room. 7 years earlier, Marin had been a graduate student in urban development at Columbia, the daughter of a contractor who had built affordable housing across 4 boroughs before a fraudulent partner had drained the company's accounts and vanished. Her father had died in the aftermath, not of any single medical event, but of the accumulated weight of betrayal, and her mother had followed him within the year, taken by a grief that the doctors called heart failure, but that Marin understood was simply the body's way of agreeing with the soul. At 26, Marin had left school, taken a maintenance job at a hotel her father had once helped build, and begun, very quietly, to rebuild what had been stolen. The accident had come 2 years later. A scaffolding collapse at a renovation site had left her with a shattered left ankle and 11 months of recovery that had taken from her the ease of movement she had once taken for granted. When she had returned to public life, she had discovered that the city's memory was short for the children of fallen builders and long for the sight of a woman who walked with a limp. What no one at the Ashford Region Hotel knew that evening, not Kirk Dunlap, not Pete Navarro, not the waitstaff or the event coordinator or the pianist playing Gershwin near the south wall, was that Marin Aldridge was the founder and chief executive of Aldridge Urban Group, a development firm that had, over the previous 4 years, quietly acquired and restored more than 60 residential properties across the tri-state area. Her company had completed the purchase of the Ashford Region Hotel that very morning. She had asked the general manager, a meticulous older man named Bernard Falk, not to announce her presence. She had told him she wanted to observe the property's culture from the inside, the way her father had always done, by sitting at a table where no one knew her name. Kirk Dunlap rose from his chair the moment Raymond and Hazel reached the center of the ballroom. He lifted his glass high enough for the gesture to catch the attention of the tables nearby, and he called out in a voice calibrated to carry across white linen and crystal. He announced that the guest of honor had finally arrived. He told the room that he and the boys had taken it upon themselves to find their good friend Raymond a companion for the evening, someone perfectly matched to a man who spent his days under other people's sinks. He gestured toward the corner table where Marin sat and declared, with a grin wide enough to show his back teeth, that the two of them were practically made for each other since neither one of them had anywhere better to be. 3 of the men at Kurt's table laughed immediately. 2 others looked at their plates. A woman at the next table set down her fork and turned to watch. Raymond stopped walking. Hazel, sensing the change in her father's posture, pressed herself closer to his side and looked up at him with the focused attention of a child who has learned to read weather before it arrives. Kirk, encouraged by the laughter, continued. He told the room that Raymond was the kind of man who brought his daughter to a black tie event because he could not afford a sitter, and that the woman at the corner table was the kind of woman who came to parties alone because no one had thought to invite her. He suggested, with a wink that traveled poorly across the room, that the 2 of them should be grateful anyone had bothered to put them in the same sentence. The laughter thinned. An older man at a far table removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. A server near the kitchen entrance closed her eyes for a moment. Raymond looked across the ballroom at the woman sitting alone at the corner table. He saw the stillness of her posture, the way her fingers had tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of her water glass, and the careful blankness of her expression, which he recognized immediately because it was the same expression he had taught himself to wear in the months after his wife's death. The face a person puts on when they have decided that showing pain in public is a luxury they cannot afford. He did not look at Kirk. He did not respond to the laughter. He bent down to Hazel, placed one hand gently on the side of her face, and told her they were going to go say hello to someone. Then he walked, unhurried and upright, across the length of the ballroom to the corner table where Maren Aldridge sat with her untouched water glass and her quiet dignity. He stopped at a respectful distance from her chair. He told her good evening, and his voice carried the plain courtesy of a man who had been raised to greet strangers the way he greeted neighbors. He asked if the seat across from her was taken. She looked up at him, studied his face for a moment longer than she might have intended, and told him it was not. He pulled the chair out for Hazel first, settled the girl into it, and placed her tote bag on the table beside her. Then he drew back the second chair and sat down across from Maren with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided where he wanted to be. He told her, quietly enough that only she could hear, that he was sorry for what had just happened. He told her that he'd been invited here under false pretenses, and that whatever game was being played at his expense and hers, she deserved better than to be used as the punchline. Maren watched him as he spoke, and what surprised her was not the apology itself but the absence of any performance in it. He was not making a show of decency for the benefit of the room. He was speaking to her the way a person speaks to another person when both of them have been standing in the rain and one of them finally has the sense to offer an umbrella. Kirk, from across the room, sensed the atmosphere shifting in a direction he had not planned. He stood up again, bourbon in hand, and crossed the ballroom with the loose confidence of a man who still believed he was the author of the evening. He stopped at the edge of the corner table, looked down at Raymond and Maren and Hazel, and remarked that the picture was even better than he had imagined. A plumber playing Prince, a cripple playing Cinderella, and a kid who did not understand she was at the wrong party. The word landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Maren's jaw tightened. A woman 2 tables away inhaled audibly. Hazel looked up at Kirk with the steady, unblinking gaze of a child who does not yet know how to pretend she has not heard something. Raymond set his hands flat on the table. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Kirk with an expression that was not anger and was not pity, but was something closer to the kind of clarity that arrives when a man has finally seen the full shape of another man's smallness. He told Kirk that if this was what Kirk considered humor, he understood now why the people who worked for Kirk laughed only when Kirk was watching. He told him that a grown man who built his entertainment out of other people's pain was not a man at all, but a boy who had never been corrected, and he said, glancing briefly at Hazel, that he would not allow his daughter to spend another minute in the company of someone who used the word Kirk had just used to describe a woman he did not know. The ballroom went quiet in sections, the way a theater goes quiet when the audience realizes the play has become real. A waiter stopped mid-pour. The pianist let a phrase trail off without resolution. Kirk tried to recover. He called the whole thing a joke, said Raymond was being dramatic, said everyone needed to relax. He repeated the word joke twice in one sentence, the way a man repeats a word when he can feel it losing its meaning. Maren had not spoken. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the exchange the way a woman watches something she has seen before in a different room with different men. But when Kirk turned to her and suggested, with a smile that had gone stiff at the edges, that she should lighten up and enjoy the evening since it was not as though she had better offers, something behind her eyes shifted. She did not respond to Kirk. She turned instead to Raymond and told him, in a voice that was steady and private and entirely her own, that she would like to stay. Raymond nodded once. He told her they would stay. Kirk lingered for a moment, mouth slightly open, waiting for the room to return to his side. It did not. He walked back to his table, and 2 of the men who had been sitting there were already reaching for their coats. The first course arrived, and the corner table found, almost by accident, the rhythm of 2 people who had decided to be present for each other, without yet understanding why. Raymond asked Maren whether the bread was any good. Maren, sounding faintly startled by the ordinariness of the question, told him she had not tried it. He pushed the basket toward her and told her the butter was better than it had any right to be at a place like this. And the sentence made her laugh for the first time in a very long time. A short, surprised laugh that she covered with her hand as though she had been caught doing something she had forgotten she was allowed to do. He asked her what she did. She told him, carefully, that she worked in property development. He asked her if she liked it. She paused, and then told him she did, that there was something about taking a building no one believed in anymore, and making it into a place where someone could begin again. He nodded at that, the way a man nods when he recognizes a feeling he has had but never put into words. She asked him about Hazel. He told her the short version, the version he had learned to tell without his voice breaking, which was that his wife had died when Hazel was a baby, and that he had been figuring it out since then. One braid and one packed lunch at a time. He told her he was not very good at most of it, but that he showed up every day, and that Hazel had taught him that showing up was almost always enough. Maren looked at Hazel, who had opened her sketchbook and was drawing something with deep concentration, her tongue pressed against her lower lip. She asked Raymond what the girl was drawing. He glanced over and told her it was probably a house. He said Hazel drew houses the way other kids drew animals. Every house she drew had a big window in front, so the people inside could see who was coming, and a wide porch so no one had to stand in the rain while they waited to be let in. The detail was small and specific and true, and it struck Maren in a place she had not expected to be struck. She told Raymond, very quietly, that when she was young, her father used to say the same thing about porches, that a good porch was the first act of kindness a building could offer. They looked at each other for a moment, and in the look was the recognition of two people who had arrived at the same table by very different roads and discovered that the view was the same. Kirk Dunlap had been watching from across the room, and the sight of Raymond and Maren talking with what appeared to be genuine ease had begun to corrode something inside him. He had expected humiliation. He had expected Raymond to stammer, Maren to shrink, and the room to validate his authority the way it always had. Instead, the corner table had become the quietest and most dignified place in the ballroom, and the guests at the surrounding tables had begun to angle their chairs toward it the way people angle toward warmth. He crossed the room one final time. He stopped at the table and addressed Raymond directly, dropping all pretense of humor. He asked him flat out whether Raymond actually believed he belonged in a room like this, at a table with white linen and crystal, wearing a suit that probably cost less than the centerpiece. He asked him whether, if he was being honest with himself, he would still be sitting here with this particular woman, if he had any other option in the world. Raymond looked at Maren first. It was a brief look, but it carried something that Kirk had never learned how to carry, which was the quiet act of checking on someone before answering for yourself. Then he stood. He did not push his chair back. He did not lean forward. He rose to his full height, which was considerable, and he answered Kirk in a voice that did not need volume to fill the room. He said yes. He said he would sit at this table on any night of the week. He said he would sit at any table where someone was being made to feel less than they were, because the cost of staying silent was something he could not afford to pay in front of his daughter. Kurt told him he was acting like he was better than everyone in the room. Raymond shook his head once. He told Kirk, very evenly, that he was not trying to be better than anyone. He was only trying to be the kind of man his daughter would not one day be ashamed to remember. As he said it, several of the guests at the surrounding tables looked for the first time at Hazel, who was sitting with her pencils still in her hand, watching the grown-ups with the unbearable clarity of a child who was learning in real time what kind of adults fill the world. Hazel set her pencil down. She reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out the folded paper star she had made that afternoon from the back of a grocery receipt. She climbed off her chair with the solemn deliberateness of a child on a mission and walked the 3 steps to where Maren sat. She held the star out in both hands, the way a child holds something she considers precious. And she told Maren, in a voice that was small and certain and did not waver, that she had made this star for someone who needed it, and that she thought Maren might need it tonight. Marin looked at the star. It was uneven and creased, and had the faint ghost of a grocery list on its underside. And it was, in that moment, the most valuable object in the building. She asked Hazel very gently whether she was sure she wanted to give it away. Hazel thought about it with the gravity only 7-year-olds possess. Then she told Marin that her dad said stars were for reminding people they were not alone, and that since Marin had been sitting alone when they got there, she probably needed one more than Hazel did. She added, with a matter-of-factness that had no room for sentimentality, that she could always make another star. But she could not always find someone who needed one this much. The sentence was not designed to break a room open. That was what made it impossible to withstand. Marin pressed her fingers to her mouth. A woman at the next table turned away and reached for her napkin. The older man who had earlier removed his glasses put them back on so he could see the child more clearly, and then removed them again because his eyes had blurred. Marin took the paper star. She held it carefully in both hands and told Hazel, in a voice that did not entirely belong to her, "Thank you." Hazel nodded once as though the matter were settled and walked back to her father. Raymond gathered her against his side and pressed his cheek to the top of her head and told her she had done something good. Kirk Dunlap stood at the edge of the table with his bourbon glass and his empty smile, and the room had left him, not dramatically, not with shouts or accusations, but with the quiet, devastating withdrawal of attention that happens when a group of people collectively decides that someone is no longer worth looking at. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and Bernard Falk, the general manager of the Ashford Region Hotel, entered with 2 assistants behind him. He had been looking for Marin for over an hour. His face, when he saw her at the corner table, moved through concern and into a sharp, formal apology. He crossed to her, inclined his head, and addressed her as Miss Aldridge. He told her the board of directors was assembled in the executive suite and had been waiting for her review of the property. He asked if she required anything before he escorted her upstairs. The murmur that passed through the ballroom was not loud. It was the sound of 100 people recalculating everything they thought they knew. Kirk's face went through several stages of color before arriving at something close to white. He looked at Bernard, then at Marin, then back at Bernard, and his mouth opened and produced nothing. Bernard saw Kirk for the first time. His eyebrows rose slightly at the way the man was standing over Marin's chair. He turned to the room and said, with the measured clarity of a man who had spent 35 years in luxury hospitality and had learned exactly when to use a sentence like a scalpel, that Marin Aldridge was the founder and chief executive of Aldridge Urban Group. He informed them that her company had finalized the acquisition of the Ashford Region Hotel that morning. He told them, with the faintest trace of a smile, that every person in the ballroom was her guest. The room did not gasp. It did something quieter and more thorough. It rearranged itself. The men at Kirk's former table studied the tablecloth with sudden interest. A woman who had earlier whispered something about Marin's limp pressed her hand flat against her sternum, as though trying to hold something inside her chest. Kirk took a half-step backward, as though the additional distance might somehow undo the previous 2 hours. Marin stood. She placed her napkin on the table and adjusted the collar of her dress with the steady hands of a woman who had survived rooms far worse than this one. She looked at Kirk and told him, without raising her voice, that she was aware he had not known who she was. She told him that was exactly why what he had done tonight mattered. She told him he had decided, before knowing anything about her, that she was no one, and that the decision had given him permission to be cruel. Kirk tried, with the last thread of his composure, to call the evening a misunderstanding. He used the word joke twice in one sentence in a voice that sounded like a tire-losing air. Marin waited until he had finished. Then she told him something she would later be quoted on in an industry profile that would run in 3 national publications. She told him that a joke required laughter from the person it was aimed at. Anything else was just cruelty looking for an audience. She turned to Bernard. She asked him for the guest list, the name of the contracting firm currently retained by the property, and a full review of the conduct standards for all vendors and guests at any Aldridge event. Bernard produced a pen from his inside pocket and began to write. Kirk's remaining colleague at the far table stood, collected his jacket, and walked toward the exit without looking back. What Marin did next was the thing that stayed with every person in the ballroom long after the evening ended. She did not raise her voice. She did not have Kirk removed by force. She did not return the cruelty that had been given to her, which would have been deeply satisfying to nearly everyone present and beneath her in every way that counted. She addressed the room. She told them, simply and without ceremony, that elegance was not measured by the thread count of the tablecloths or the vintage of the wine. It was measured by how a person chose to treat someone who could offer them nothing in return. She told them that her father, who had built buildings for people who could not afford architects, had taught her that the truest test of character happened in the rooms where no one important was watching. The contract with Kirk's firm was terminated the following Monday. Kirk himself was escorted from the ballroom that night by 2 members of the hotel's security team. Quietly and without spectacle, he left with the only thing he had ever truly valued taken from him, which was a room full of people willing to laugh when he pointed. When the ballroom had begun to empty and the pianist had returned to Gershwin, Marin walked back to the corner table where Raymond stood with Hazel asleep against his shoulder, her canvas tote bag hanging from his free hand. Marin looked at the sleeping child and then at the man holding her, and she asked him, very softly, whether Hazel always carried paper stars in her bag. Raymond told her that Hazel made one every day. He said it had started after his wife died, when a grief counselor had suggested the girl find a small ritual to help her feel she was putting something good into the world. He said most of the stars ended up in a shoebox under her bed, but that every now and then Hazel decided one of them was meant for someone specific. And when that happened, the child's certainty was absolute. Marin looked at the paper star still in her hand. She turned it over and saw the faint grocery list on the back. Milk and bread and apples. And the ordinariness of it made her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. She told Raymond she would keep it. In the weeks that followed, Marin began work on something her board did not immediately understand. She called it the Open Porch Initiative, a program funded directly by Aldridge Urban Group that would acquire neglected houses near the company's hotel properties, restore them with care, and offer them as permanent homes to single parents and to families in crisis at below-market rates. Each house would have a wide front porch. There would be no press release on the day a family received a key. There would only be a handshake and a door that opened. She remembered Raymond while the program was still a set of drawings on her desk. She had not forgotten the way he had crossed an entire ballroom to sit with a stranger before he had any reason to know her name. She had not forgotten the patience of his hands as he pulled out a chair for his daughter and placed her tote bag beside her on the table as though it were the most natural gesture in the world. She called him on a Tuesday afternoon and offered him a position as the lead building supervisor for the initiative. Raymond, holding the phone in his work truck with joint compound still drying on his knuckles, told her quietly that he was not sure he was the right person for something like that. Marin told him she did not need someone who knew how to talk in a boardroom. She needed someone who could walk through a house and know which walls were holding weight and which ones were just pretending, and someone she trusted to hand a key to a family and mean it. He took the position 3 days later. On a warm Saturday in early April, Raymond was finishing the last repair in the kitchen of a small 3-bedroom house on the east side of town. The house was about to be given to a young father named Dennis Okafor, who had 2 daughters and a night shift at the post office. Hazel sat on the front porch drawing a house with a big window and a wide set of steps. Marin arrived a little after 3 in a white cotton blouse and jeans, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a bag of donuts. She was laughing at something before she had even reached the porch, and the sound of it made Raymond stop what he was doing and listen. The way a man listens to a song he thought he had forgotten. When Dennis Okafor received the key, he held it against his chest with both hands and stood very still for a long time. His daughters ran through the empty rooms shrieking with a joy that rattled the new windows. Raymond stood at the side of the porch with his hands in his pockets and did not step forward because he had decided long ago that good work did not need to be witnessed to be real. Hazel ran to Marin and pulled at her hand and asked her, with the urgency only a 7-year-old can manufacture, whether she still had the star. Marin opened her leather bag and lifted out the folded paper star, soft now at the creases from months of being carried. She told Hazel she had kept it every day since the night a small girl with a canvas tote bag had taught a ballroom full of adults what it looked like to be brave. Raymond, watching from the porch railing, looked at his daughter and at the woman holding the grocery receipt star between her fingers. And he had to turn his face toward the sky for a long moment before he could trust it again. The story did not end with a wedding that afternoon. It ended with 3 people on a porch as the light went long and gold across the new front steps. A young father carrying his daughters into a house that finally had his name on the lease, and a quiet understanding among the adults standing there that something had been built between them, not out of wealth or power or the machinery of romance, but out of a single ordinary act of decency offered to a stranger before there was any reason to believe the stranger had anything to give in return. Raymond Sutton had not known, on the night of the gala, that the woman at the corner table owned the building. He had only known that she was a person, that she was being hurt, and that his daughter was watching to see what kind of man her father was. That, in the end, had been enough.